I just loaded it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor to be with you there in China. I really want to follow up what Vitalik had to say by stepping to one level of abstraction higher to think about what's the underlying philosophy behind some of these ideas. So Albert Einstein once said that what the inventive genius of mankind has bestowed upon us in the last 100 years could have made human life carefree and happy if the development of the organizing power of man had been able to keep step with his technical advances. As it is, the hardly bought achievements of the machine age in the hands of our generation are as dangerous as a razor in the hands of a 3-year-old child. And so I think what Einstein was really getting at here is that...
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you share your screen?
I am sharing it. I am sharing it.
You are, and we didn't see it.
Yeah. No, I can see it.
Vitalik can see it on Zoom, but I think there's a problem on the computer on your end. It's not tuned to the Zoom channel or something like that.
Okay, we see it. We got it. Thank you. Sorry.
So here's Einstein's words. And I think like the thing I really take away from this is I actually think of a game called Civilization. So in Civilization, there's like a development of, it's a sort of strategy game on the computer. And I'll actually turn back to it later because it's interactive with radical exchange another way. But in this game, you develop different technologies, but you also develop different ways of organizing society. And I think what Einstein was pointing out here is that we've had a lot more evolution, especially recently, in our technologies than in our way of organizing society. And I think that's constraining human development. It's creating inequality. It's creating a lot of risk of extinction of mankind and so forth. We need technologies for organizing ourselves that keep pace with the development of our tools. And I think that that's really the key spirit of radical exchange. And to make progress like that, I think it's absolutely critical that we learn to think of social organization a bit more like a technology and a bit less like, polar opposites. We're used to these debates, to these binaries in thinking about social organization. And the way that we actually make progress in technology is not by like holding up a binary like the internet is great or biology is great, but rather like how do we combine biology into the internet, or how do we take the insights from quantum computing and bring them together with brain-computer interfaces and things like this. So some examples of binaries that have, I think, been holding us back in the social and political realm are those between democracy and the nation state on the one hand, and sort of libertarian capitalism on the other hand. Binaries between populism and technocracy. Binaries between cosmopolitanism, the notion that we're all part of one global, community, and nationalism on the other hand. And radical exchange is about using the synthesis between these two extremes to allow us to make sort of technology style fundamental progress in the way that we organize ourselves. And today I'm really only going to have a chance to focus on breaking down one of these. I'll start with the first one, this one about capitalism versus democracy or democratic socialism, markets versus democracy and democratic socialism, which are often thought to be in conflict. But I'm going to do that because it fits very well with what Vitalik talked about, and I'll actually refer back to quadratic funding. But pretty core to radical exchange is getting past some of these other binaries as well, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. The second core, so So the first core value of radical exchange is this idea of social technology that progresses along with physical technology. The second core value is the transcending of these binaries between markets and democracy, between technocracy and populism, etc. And the third value, which Vitalik didn't really get at too much, but that I think I increasingly focus on, is what I would call pluralism. There's sort of a perspective that's very dominant in a lot of economics, a lot of analytic social sciences, where you think of there being sort of like the government, the social planner, the society, and the individual. But the reality is there's both no such thing as like the world government. There's a bunch of different social organizations out there, and there's really no such thing as the like individual's complete self-interest, because the things I want usually for my family or for my community. I share most of the things that I consume with lots of other people. And so a much more productive way to think about this instead is there being a bunch of different communities, and individuals lie at the intersection of these communities. And the communities are in turn the intersections of individuals. And so what we want so much, not so much is decentralization and devolution of power to the atomized individual, but rather a diversity of communities to hold power, and through that to make it possible for the individual to have agency. Okay, so let me focus now on this overcoming one of these divides that I talked about. So the fundamental idea behind capitalism is that you can have people competing to make profits, and this will lead to efficient production. And this holds under certain theoretical conditions, and the most important of these is something called decreasing returns. So decreasing returns is the notion that the more and more we do of something, the less valuable it becomes on the margin. So if you put more and more people into a factory, eventually it gets very crowded. The machines can't handle all the people, and the additional output that people produce declines. And this is really important to capitalism, because in order for capitalism to be efficient, for it to be just, everyone has to be paid sort of meritocratically. They have to be paid for the additional amount that their work produces. And if you have decreasing returns, the additional amount that the last person produces is less than the additional amount that the people before her produce. And that means that if you pay everyone their marginal product, you will still have something left over. And you can see that in this graph on the left. This sort of traces back the tangent line, which is how much you're paying people, to the origin. And the gap there is the profit earned. But there's this allows there to be profitable companies that are still doing things efficiently. This is the foundation argument that markets and capitalism lead to efficient. However, this just can't be at the core of what has led to the success of the modern period, the success often attributed to capitalism. Because if it were, then most phenomena that we'd be dealing with would have decreasing returns. And if most things had decreasing returns, you would expect everyone to be living in sort of huts on their own in the middle of nowhere to minimize those decreasing returns. But instead, what we see is at the heart of capitalism, the heart of a dynamic economy, are cities, networks, areas where people cluster together and can achieve more together than they can separately. And that phenomenon is called increasing. It's when the additional value increases the more people or inputs are included. And this is very problematic for capitalism, because if you pay everyone the efficient amount, the fair amount, the amount of additional value that they add, then that will use up more than the total amount that you produce. So that will actually lead you to go bankrupt. And it means that profitability is fundamentally inconsistent with efficiency. And these are really the cases that Vitalik was highlighting, the cases where there's no logical business model for something that nonetheless is creating a huge amount of value. And what really logical business model means there is not that there is no possible business model, but that any business model that you used would undermine the value. And in fact, that's very classic thing for software, right? So software is a classic case of increasing returns. The marginal cost of having more people use the software is very low, maybe even close to zero, but there's significant costs of developing it. And that means that any company that tried to just charge that marginal cost, that tried to make the software efficiently available to everyone, would not be able to fund initial development. And that basically forces us into one of two extremes. Either we go down the route of sort of open source software as it's traditionally been conceived, where you end up with like people who are doing the most basic protocols that keep the internet running, people who are managing SSL and so forth, being unable to support themselves, being homeless, as shown on right here. Or you have some sort of intellectual property regime and you protect the entrepreneurs, in which case they become monopolists, they charge high prices, they exclude all sorts of people that would have value from using the product. And you end up with the situation that my company, Microsoft, was in the 1990s. And so neither of these works particularly well. And this is the reason why capitalism tends to lead to all of these problems. But the paradox is that almost all of the great achievements that are attributed to capitalism actually come from these increasing returns phenomena. In fact, the word bourgeoisie comes from the idea of a city, and cities were made possible by all the public infrastructure shared by the people in the city, by the value of them clustering together, a classic increasing returns phenomena. The initial example that sort of launched economics was that of a pin factory, where the whole concept was that by getting many people together in a room, they're able to be more efficient than they are on their own. The next industrial revolution was fueled by electricity, which runs on electrical grids, which are a classic increasing returns network. And of course, the modern information technology is the ultimate example of a networked good. So like almost everything that the champions of capitalism and economic development would hold up as examples are examples of why capitalism can't be efficient. And in fact, it's no surprise that we see all over the world right now huge numbers of problems that result precisely from capitalism run wild that are entirely predictable if you understand that increasing returns are consistent with efficiency in capital. We see tech platforms that have gained monopolies over so much of our lives and that are creating a huge amount of backlash. Again, classic network effect, increasing returns. And in fact, even and especially Americans, who are usually offenders in the United States of the untrammeled power of business, are really worried about the power that these platforms have over censorship and so forth. You see a proliferation of low quality news and a huge underfunding of high quality news to compete with it, because news is a classic increasing returns good. Everyone can consume it once it's created. There's even paywalls aren't very useful because the actual information leaks out. There's just no real way to capture the value there. And so then people get an incentive to instead get people to look at stuff, to get advertising, rather than to actually create the valuable information. Global warming, another classic increasing returns phenomenon. It's something that applies to all of us. And therefore, there's just like no way to capture the value associated with it. COVID, another classic example where the United States has actually spent a huge amount of money reacting to COVID, economic stimulus, treating sick people, whereas places like China and Taiwan have spent far less reacting to COVID because they actually did it on a population-wide basis, where they actually took it as a public health matter and they suppressed the disease. So that's a case where it's far cheaper, actually, to sort of defend the whole populace than it is to individually help people sick if you fail to defend the whole populace. But that was just basically neglected in a capitalist system. So almost all of the major problems we're facing in the world can be thought of as cases of these increasing returns phenomena that are not well managed by capitalism. And this basically means that at its heart, capitalism is a contradiction. If you just look at in all the inventions that capitalism takes credit for, television broadcasting, cell phones, ATMs, all these things that are like the lifeblood of capitalism are just inconsistent with the theory, the story that capitalism tells about why it's efficient. But this solution, the populist solution, which is instead to empower some sort of democratic nation state to manage these things, is, if anything, even more problematic. And the reason is that most of these patterns of public goods cut clear across nation states. They don't actually correspond to some particular jurisdiction that could meaningfully democratically manage these things. So think about the Amazon River. This cuts across 6 countries and is mainly in parts of the countries that are not highly inhabited. So you basically have the democratic majorities of these countries making decisions for a bunch of minorities cutting across a bunch of countries. And so it's not surprising that they end up having an interest in exploiting the river rather than maintaining it, because they both want to take away the value that goes to the other countries, get their part without worrying about the others, and they don't care about these minorities within their countries that really value the river. This happens even at smaller jurisdictions. So we have cities, but cities are both too big and too small. They're too big for the minorities that live within them that often get oppressed by the police and the majorities within the cities, and they're too small for the urban periphery where many poor people are forced to live. So we have to move beyond both sort of the democratic nation state and capitalism to things that bring markets together with the dynamism of markets, together with, and flexibility, together with the accountability and responsiveness that democratic institutions have. And that's one of many binaries that we have to transcend. And this gives a list of some of the others. Now, Vitalik described a design that I came up with him and with Zoe Hitzig, who's a Harvard PhD student and great poet, called quadratic finance. And I'm not going to go too much into how that works because Vitalik went through it. But again, the basic idea here is that we transcend the division between markets and democratic states. We take into account the sort of flexibility and diversity that markets allow, that people can fund different things however they want and so forth. But we take into account the basic insight that markets undermine these public goods and instead create a market with a more democratic principle lying behind it. But one thing Vitalik didn't really get at, and I think this came out in some of the question period, is that where is the funding coming from for these things? And there's actually a really nice thought, which is that these public goods create is going to end up somewhere. And a classic example of this is if you build a really nice new school in a neighborhood in the United States, usually the values of land around that school go up because people want to go to that school. And in fact, under certain conditions, the value of the land will exactly increase in total by the value that the school created. So if you could tax away that increased value, you'd have the ability to fund any school that was worth creating. And so this is a natural basis for funding public goods. And by activities in the economy can be divided into increasing return activities that really can't fund themselves but throw off all this value, and decreasing returns activities that will earn profits, as we were saying. But that these things equal to each other. All the value created by increasing returns activities is eventually absorbed by some decreasing returns activity. And you can just think of this like in computer science, there's this notion of a directed acyclic graph where, sort of things flow from certain source nodes towards certain sink nodes. And all the value that exits a source node ends up at some sink node. So what you really need to do is find those decreasing returns activities, take the value out of them, recycle them back into increasing returns activities, and then you sort of have electricity, the value in the economy flowing around faster and faster, almost like a superconductor, and you sort of see the economy and the value created within it take off. And that's really the goal of economic policy. Now, a real question is, how can you tax away the value of those decreasing returns activities without slowing down the economy? And there was a great insight that actually originally came from the forefather of the Chinese Revolution, Sun Yat-sen, which was that you could actually make the market more dynamic, more competitive, more efficient, more flexible by imposing a tax on the value of land and allowing land to effectively flow to its best use more effectively and not get monopolized. And this was crystallized into an idea by Arnold Harberger in the following quote. He was suggesting tax systems for Chile, Latin America. He said, if you have to make base for taxes, adopt criteria that determine the true economic value. The solution the economist offers is simple and direct. Allow the owner to declare the value himself, make the value public, and oblige the owner to sell his property to any person willing to pay the declared value. This is simple and creates incentives even beyond those existing in the market for assets to be employed in their most economic use. So this idea, which is called self-assessed licenses sold at auctions, or a Harberger tax, or the common ownership self-assessed tax, is a way of providing the funding that goes into the quadratic finance type systems, which on the one hand makes a much more dynamic market, on the other hand imposes a large tax. And so it sort of shows a way in which actually you can have more competitive markets by having a sort of more socialist system that funds things more in these collective ways. These types of ideas actually have a long history in ancient Greece, in Denmark. Estonia is using similar things to tax land and so forth. Now, they're quite ambitious ideas. They're quite transformative, and they, as Vitala pointed out, really have to build up through experiment. But even before we have them, there are more near-term things that we can do to move towards this type of an idea. So, for example, Professor Colin Meyer at Oxford and Michelle Meager, who's a lawyer in London, have argued that rather than focus on controlling the power of companies through breaking them up, as antitrust would have you do, we could instead try to use the power that antitrust gives us to transform companies into democracies that have to be accountable to their stakeholders, to the consumers that they have, to their workers, rather than just the owners. And that this offers a way for us to begin to create new types of democracy, international types of democracy, organized around goods that people are consuming, rather than just traditional lines of nation or language. Now, these are just a few of the ideas that Radical Exchange has been developing. Others include governance methods like quadratic voting, migration patterns like the Visa Between Individuals program, other ideas in antitrust, a notion of data collaboratives where data is owned by a community of people who it pertains to, and they negotiate for its value, the polis system of deliberation that uses clustering and statistical methods to help people have at-scale democratic conversations, and something called intersectional social data, which is a different type of data structure, sort of analogous to the blockchain, that helps represent these sort of pluralistic communities. But the thing I really want to emphasize is while these ideas are quite bold, they're actually already playing out there. Vitalik talked about Gitcoin grants. The Colorado State Legislature used quadratic voting to allocate its budget, and their executive administration is using it to prioritize all sorts of things. In Taiwan, they've used quadratic voting and this polis system to help the society come to consensus about a lot of questions they're facing. And we now have about 100 local groups around the world that are working on applying these ideas in their communities. There are a couple of cases that are particularly striking about this. So Taiwan has an extremely vibrant digital democracy that uses a lot of these ideas, from data collaboratives, which they use to have bottom-up groups that create data and use it to bargain with the platforms and bargain with the government rather than just receiving services from the platforms and the government. They then use quadratic voting to prioritize some of these ideas and to get them more attention. And they've built this into a platform called vTaiwan that has about a quarter of the island's population as monthly active users and a half that have used it at some point. And they use this polis system to help come to sort of democratic consensus in a participatory way. But it's not just Taiwan. Estonia has been doing many similar things. They have a land tax, like the ones we were talking about before. They have a whole range of digital democracy tools, etc. And we're trying to build examples like this in the United States, in Colorado, which, as Vitalik pointed out, has been using quadratic funding to support local businesses. It's been using quadratic voting. In the legislature, we're about to start a project on self-assessed licenses with them for marijuana, etc. And the thing that I think is quite remarkable is that if you look at the performance of countries in combating COVID, the countries that were most successful were actually the ones who were most adapting these types of tools. So Taiwan was by far the lowest number of deaths per million in the world, and had the smallest hit to GDP because of COVID. Estonia was the strongest within the West. So I hope many of you will be inspired to get engaged with us in these ideas. We are telling people about it in many different formats. I have this book, Radical Markets. The game Civilization that I mentioned to you, the most popular strategy game of all time, now incorporates quadratic voting and a number of other radical exchange ideas into the gameplay. We have galleries that are using this to get feedback. We are engaging with filmmakers and comic book writers and so forth. But it's not just about stories, it's about actually how we live our lives. People are using these things to organize their communities, to deal with problems of water in India, to student groups, to build games that people play together, and etc. And we're bringing this into the political arena as well. One of the top politicians in Canada is campaigning on these things. We in the US, we had sort of a parallel COVID response that was the basis of the legislation that's batting around Congress, that was done by a bunch of people within the Radical Exchange community. On the upper right, this is a picture of Vitalik, our CEO, Jen Marone, and Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister in Taipei. And we're working with politicians in Latin America, around the world. So I hope many of you will be inspired to get engaged with these ideas. I think they have the potential to really transform how we govern our society and transcend many of the divides that we've gotten ourselves into. Thank you.
好，我们下面继续进入到我们的评述人和问答环节。再次请上易思、苏喜和黄老师。
Once again, I would like to invite our commentators